Hello and welcome to Morning File. I'm your host, Emma McCarty, and today I am joined with Ananya Yadav, Henry Challen, and Wendy Zhang to discuss their podcast about all things climate change. So to start, do you guys maybe want to just talk about your podcast in general, how it got started, what it's about a little bit more?
Yeah, so Wendy, Henry, and we were all a part of the City Lab Semester in Residence program, which is offered at McMaster, and it's in partnership with City Lab Hamilton, who work with the City of Hamilton. So our team, there's one other student who worked on it with us, but our team basically was connected with Hamilton Public Works, who are working on their first climate resiliency strategy. So we were connected with them to kind of work on conducting some background research, and we did a lot of best practices research for them. And we ended up compiling a recommendations report that we presented to the city. But while doing our research, we were in contact with a lot of different people from across Canada, sustainability leaders across Canada, so locally and nationally. And so we decided that because the program is based on the principles of community engagement, and we wanted to find a way to kind of make some of the conversations we were having being heard to a larger audience. So due to the restrictions placed upon us on the pandemic, initially we were kind of we were kind of confused as to what we would do, but I think it actually worked out in our benefit because it actually allowed us to reach out to more people. And so the podcast was a perfect fit because the Semester in Residence program already has a podcast that they produce. But so we decided to do a series titled Resilient Cities within it. And we recorded all our conversations. And so now they are up on that podcast.
Yeah, awesome. Did you want to explain just a little bit more about exactly what the podcast is about, maybe a little bit about what people can expect from each episode?
Yeah, so essentially what we were hoping to gain from our conversations on the podcast is, so we spoke to local leaders like people from Environment Hamilton or the Bay Area Restoration Council, or also we spoke to people nationally, such as we spoke to the Director of Sustainability in Vancouver, and we also spoke to the climate resiliency team in, for example, cities like Calgary and Edmonton and Montreal. So what essentially we were hoping to hear from them is how they kind of changed policies and attitudes in their cities, because these are cities that already have established programs in place. So, and we wanted to see what their recommendations were for a city like Hamilton, who is just starting out. How exactly do you go about bringing about climate change, climate action, and embed it into the policies of the city, and how do you get the community involved while doing so? So that's kind of what that was the focus of our conversations with them, and that's kind of what you will see when listening to the podcast. And it's a lot of them just saying, this is what a city would need to do, like how to get political support, how do you get the community involved, so things like that.
Yeah. So what are you hoping is maybe the number one takeaway that people get from listening to the podcast?
So, well, first and foremost, we hope that people enjoy the podcast and have a good time listening to them. We put a lot of work into them and have some good conversation. We also hope that by listening to the podcast, students will be inspired and motivated to take climate action in Hamilton. As we mentioned in many of our podcasts, the time to tackle climate change is now. And that the pandemic has been a good reminder and a good catalyst for the change that's needed within the city and within the wider community. Climate change is a much larger issue than the pandemic, but it's just that the effects are felt over a larger span of time. So we don't see the effects in a day-to-day setting. It's more of a much larger issue. And we hope that by listening to the conversations from local leaders or cities who have already made great strides in building climate change resilience, this can help to motivate people within Hamilton and to show that there is hope and that there are many options for improvement.
Yeah, so we've been hearing about climate change for years and years. Why is it so important that we do change our actions and start listening to these warnings?
So I think, like we said in the previous question, it's important because you don't really see the effects for many years. So the effects we're seeing today are from our actions from decades ago. So if we want to have a better future for ourselves and for our children, we need to act now. And here in Hamilton, we're already experiencing negative effects such as massive rain events, wetter winters, more frequent flooding and droughts. And if we want to stop these changes from getting substantially worse and from adding more events to that, already somewhat frightening list, we do need to act now.
And if I can just add something to that. So this is actually something that came across almost all the conversations we had in our podcast, where our guests reiterated that oftentimes we here in Canada feel like climate change isn't something that really impacts us. But as Henry just mentioned, these are actual things, and we're already starting to see it, like this heat wave that's going on this summer, and this is just something that's beginning, or we're just starting to feel the effects of. But 5 to 10 years down the road, this will be something that you will have to deal with. Like your AC costs will go up. Your house could be flooded due to like increased rain events. So this isn't something that's far off. And I think the pandemic was a good reminder of something hitting all at once, and suddenly we're not prepared for it. So we hope the podcast acts as a motivational piece where we have time and we can act, and we don't want to be stuck in a position again where we're just kind of dealing with the impacts of all this right when they hit and when there's kind of no turning back.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to start listening and taking climate action seriously, because climate action doesn't just benefit the environment, but also benefits people who have communities that have been marginalized by our government systems. And I think that's especially important as the world comes to be more aware of some of these systematic barriers that face people.
For sure. So you mentioned before that this podcast started when the pandemic started, and how such a big event like the pandemic has shown us what type of effects big world issues can have and how climate change will impact us. What type of effects has the pandemic had on climate change?
Since the pandemic hit, people have been getting outside more, and people are starting to realize the importance of the natural environment, like going out biking. And so I think that's kind of that's made very obvious to people the importance of taking care of our earth. And also, as Ananya said before, not being prepared for a catastrophe like the pandemic is evident of what lies ahead of us down the road. It's also been very uplifting to see the whole world come together to create these vaccines and solutions to COVID in such short periods of time, and that gives us hope that can happen for climate action also.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I guess maybe my almost last question for you is, if there was one takeaway from somebody listening to this interview, something that they could do today to help the climate, what would you say to them?
Listen to our podcast, but also educate themselves on the many ways that you can become involved in climate change in your own city. One of the big things we took away from City Lab was how willing to get involved and how willing to listen local councillors, MPs, or MPPs are. And all the experts we spoke to reaffirm the fact that if you want change to happen, you don't have to do anything radical. You can always just get in contact with your local member of parliament, and they are willing to listen and want your suggestions.
Yeah, awesome. So going off of that, where can people go to listen to the podcast?
Yeah, so if you would like to listen to our Resilient Cities series on the CityCast podcast, you can go to anchor.fm/CityCast. So it's available on most major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts. If you use Google, it's there. So if you search up CityCast, you will find our podcast. And if you're interested in listening to our specific climate change series on it, it's titled Resilient Cities.
Thank you so much to Ananya, Henry, and Wendy for joining me today to talk about their podcast and the importance of climate change. For more content like this, you can visit cfmu.ca and make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a video.